Welcome back to the podcast Be Unexpected with Jake and Wyatt. Today we're joined by Jen Lada, ESPN reporter. Jen, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, guys. Wyatt, it's so good to see you. I know it's been a while, but I've been following your success over social media, and I'm so excited to be hanging out with a superstar like you. And Jake, I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, Jen, maybe start off share where you're from and how you grew up.
Sure, I grew up in Northern Illinois. I work in Milwaukee now, or I live in Milwaukee now, so it's really close to where I grew up. But oldest of four, we lived in a very athletic household, competitive household, which really started my love of sports. But I always tell people that when I was a kid, there were organized sports. You could certainly join organized sports, but there weren't a lot of opportunities for girls. In fact, some of the best athletes that I knew as a kid who were girls played on the boys' teams, so on the boys' soccer team or on the boys' baseball teams and whatnot. So I followed a pretty traditional path where I was in youth sports and was a cheerleader and played basketball and ran cross country and track when I was in grade school. And then in high school did all of those things as well. I ended up cheering and running cross country and track. My dad was actually our head coach when I was a kid. So that was part of all building those, building blocks to be in the competitive space, to be in the sports space. But, I always tell people that when it comes to me being in sports, my family and my parents were really into watching games and taking us to games. And we actually traveled in an RV down to the Olympics in 1996 when they were in Atlanta. So just being exposed to all of those things really gave us that front row seat to what sports was. And it's a big reason why ultimately, years later when I was picking a career and I had done a lot of public speaking and I had done a lot of writing, it just felt like a really good marriage of my talents to be in the journalism space in sports.
Oh yeah, for sure.
When you were younger, let's say in high school, did you have a passion for speaking and just being involved in getting to know people's stories, or just taking a deeper interest in other people and their stories? Is that kind of how we're all stirred your passion for
A
that?
little bit, yeah. So what I always tell people is you don't realize it until you're able to look backwards in retrospect. But you can see the breadcrumbs that ultimately led to where I ended up. So my parents had me reading in church when I was a kid. So I was standing up there at the lectern doing readings on Sunday. I was in school plays. I was in scholarship pageants. I did all of those little things. I was a writer, so I won young authors when I was in grade school and ended up going to Peoria, Illinois for the state gathering for young authors. So all of those little things I feel were hints as to what I was going to do. When I got to Marquette in the late 90s, early 2000s, I did know that I would be in the College of Communications. I didn't know if I would do PR. I always thought I would be a speechwriter or something along those lines. At one point, I thought I might be interested in being a lawyer just because of the ability to kind of present an argument and defend a case and whatnot. I always thought I could be good at that. But I was in the College of Communications. I was sitting in a class, and we were discussing the Marquette basketball team, which is having a hell of a season right now. And I had been dating a guy on the team, so I knew a lot of the ins and outs of what was happening on a daily basis. And so I realized that I had a lot to contribute to the conversation. And one of the dudes was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about sports? Have you ever thought of being in the sports journalism space?" And I have to be honest with you, I hadn't, because I hadn't seen a lot of women in the sports space. I honestly didn't think that it was a realistic, actual job that women could hold. So then once you realize that it was a possibility, even though there weren't a ton of people out there doing it, there were some. Robin Roberts was in the space. Hannah Storm was in the space. Then it became well, could I do this? Well, let's see. And so I started down that path, and I've never looked back.
Awesome. So then coming out of Marquette, what was your first job that you had in broadcasting?
So right out of Marquette, my first job was a non-paid position because I was so good that they were like, "We are not going to pay you." It was a non-paid position at a place called Watts Communications. They produced a weekly program called Preps Plus, and that was a high school sports show in the Milwaukee area. So I would go out on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, collect the sports stories, go to games, tell these little vignette stories, and then we would pre-produce them to air on Saturday morning on the local NBC station. And I thought it was the biggest deal in the whole world. Like, I remember waking up on Saturday mornings, recording it on my VCR, this is pre-DVR, because I thought it was like so incredible that I was doing these little sports snippets on television. But I was waitressing in order to pay my rent. I was
Yeah.
waitressing in order to pay my car payment. So it's a tough existence when you first start out, to the point that I wasn't making any money in broadcasting when I first started. But then after that, I got a job in Rockford, Illinois. I was hired as the weekend sportscaster. I was very young. I think I was 23, 24. And, I've always looked young. So you can imagine I looked like I was 14 on television at the time. We would get emails to the station that were like, who is this child that is delivering the sports this evening? So then from Rockford, I went back to Milwaukee because I had gone to Marquette. I worked there for 7 years. Then I went to Chicago and was there for 2.5 years, which was huge for me because I'm from Northern Illinois. I had grown up as a Bears fan. I had grown up as a huge Bulls fan. The Bulls in the 90s were just this epic dynasty squad.
Yeah.
And then I was a Cubs fan. So to be back in Chicago just felt like, okay, if I don't go anywhere else, if this is the apex of my career, I could do this for the rest of my life. And then 8 years ago, I got a call from ESPN, and I've been there ever since.
Wow. Do you remember that day and that what they called you, and how did that even link up with obviously being in Chicago? I'm sure that was cool being around all that. But the day ESPN gave you a call, what was that conversation like, and then what happened after
Jake,
that?
it was very complicated, if I'm going to be honest with you. So the reality
it wasn't
is,
like, oh yeah, you're on game day.
Not even a little bit. So the reality there is, Colin Cowherd, who is a national host currently with Fox, had been at ESPN for a really long time. I just loved the way he did his radio show. I found him very interesting, very captivating, and he was looking for a co-host. And so my agent had me audition to be his co-host. I went out to Bristol, Connecticut, met with Colin, met with the talent office. And he and I got along really well. Like, there was a good yin and yang. I thought, like, okay, this is a relationship that we could really foster and develop, and we could be really good in this space. But he was also going through contract negotiations at ESPN, and Fox was trying to lure him over to them. So he made me very aware throughout the entire process that there was a chance he would go to Fox, but that I should keep, pursuing ESPN on the off chance that he chose to stay. And there was a chance at the time he was like, well, if I go to Fox, you could come to Fox with me and all of that. So when I say complicated, this is what I mean. It was not straightforward. It was not direct. It was not, we want you at ESPN, come to ESPN. It was all of these like exit ramps and side roads. So I ended up signing with ESPN, and we moved to Connecticut from Chicago. And we had been there for less than a week when we got a call. And I always tell people it was 7 a.m. in Connecticut, and it was from our talent manager, who I knew was at the ESPYs in LA. So I quickly did the math and was like, why is he calling me at 4:30 in the morning local time? And he was calling me to tell me that Colin had taken a job at Fox. And he was like, but don't worry, we're going to find a spot for you at ESPN. I was like, well, I certainly hope so, because I just uprooted my family from the state that I've grown up in to the East Coast. I don't know anyone out here. We just enrolled my son in school, so please let's make sure we can make this work. And sure enough, they did. They put me on a radio show. It was did not go well, and for a myriad of reasons, but it was very frustrating for me at the time. I'm a type A personality. I like to have success. I think I always set myself up for success. So to not have success right away at ESPN felt very damning. But I worked on knocking on doors, making connections, trying to show people what I could do. Look, I'd been in television at that point for 15 years. So I knew that I could contribute if I was given the opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I did Mike and Mike. I did Baseball Tonight. I did digital work. And I started doing features in the feature space. And I got a call from one of the main bosses on ESPN who oversees College Game Day saying, we're looking to add a feature reporter. It will be sporadic work, will not be every week. But if you're interested, we'd love to have you on College Game Day. And what I always tell people is, I grew up in Northern Illinois, okay? Nothing against Northern Illinois. We have a hell of a sports city. But what we don't have is college football. right? Like, no
Yeah.
disrespect to Northwestern or, any of the other peripheral squads that, sometimes claim Chicago, but it wasn't something that I grew up with. So I was like, oh, cool. That'll be great. And the boss looked at me and was like, most people have a bigger reaction to being invited to be on college game day. But I didn't know
Yeah.
what I didn't know. And so I've been on game day ever since,
Right.
and it's been an awesome experience. Now it's myself and Gene Wojciechowski, who are the features reporters for game day, and we're there every weekend.
Nice. So when you do these stories for College Game Day or just ESPN, like, what has it taught you about going through adversity in sports or just in life? Because you get to listen to these people that overcome, like, all kinds of odds.
Yeah, well, I love doing the story with you, Wyatt, and your family several years back. That was amazing because, again, it
Oh,
gave us the
thanks.
opportunity to show some of the things that you had been through. But again, at the end of the day, it's always about overcoming the adversity and how you have
Right.
these roadblocks and challenges and hurdles in your path. But when you're determined to succeed, you can end up beating all of those odds. So what it's taught me about myself is it's taught me a lot of empathy. I would say that, in this business and in others, it can be very competitive and you can kind of like put your head down and nose to the grindstone and not allow any of the distractions to take you off your path. And there might be a little bit of a lack of empathy just because you're so driven and you just want to succeed so much that you don't want to be distracted by any of the noise. But telling stories like I have for the last 8 years has really honed my empathy skill, which is that everybody has a hard path. Everybody goes through things. Everybody's seeing things like pain and grief and emotion. And we're all just walking around like that every day, right? And so I try to be more conscious of my interactions with people because I know I've done so many stories with so many people who are going through things, and I've gone through things personally. So I try to be more respectful of the potential that in that moment when we are interacting, they're going through something, and can I give them the grace that they need and deserve in those moments?
Right.
Wow, I bet seeing all those stories, like I had, like some of that you've seen and gone through, just gives you so much more perspective on just life and things. When you're at college game day and they do those features, are you always at the site for game day? Or are you at like a different campus doing the story, or what's that
It
like?
just depends on what the show needs.
Yeah.
So what I love about game day is it's always about what is best for the show. There was a situation that cropped up this past year where there were 3 student athletes murdered. And in that week, in that moment, the show needed someone to be there to capture what was happening on campus. And so that's where you go. You go to where the story is. For the
Yep.
most part, we do present our stories on campus that day. But there was a story this year where I was at one of the big games that game day wasn't at, but we needed to have a presence there to show that we respected the rivalry. We understood the significance of that game. And so I did all of my reports from there as opposed to where game day was that day. So we all pull the rope in the same direction, make sure we're doing what's in the best interest of the show. They tell us where to go and we just get on a plane and go.
Yeah.
Nice. So, like, when you're going through your job or just life, like, growing up and now, who do you look to, like, who motivates you to, like, work hard and, fight through adversity? Who's been a big impact
Oh,
on your
that's
life?
such a good question. I always tell people that I've never had singular role models. And I don't know if it was on purpose or if it was just by happenstance, but I always try to take a little bit from each interaction I have. And it's not always positive. Sometimes it's negative as well. Like I'll see someone carry themselves in a way that I don't think is very becoming. And so I'll just file that away like, ooh, don't do that, you know? But I guess it would have to be my parents. They taught me work ethic. They taught me taking pride in your work. They taught me determination and consistency. And all of those things are obviously huge when it comes to what contributes to success. My dad passed away within the last few months. And that's been really difficult for me because he was like my biggest fan. He was my sounding board, just the constant provider of support. And so what I've found over the last few months is when I get into a jam and I'm not sure how to handle something, I just try to like hone in on his voice and what he would have told me to do or how he would have guided me or directed me in that space. And so far it's paying off. But it's interesting when you have somebody like that who is so influential and so just such a strong presence like my dad was, to then not have that has been a real wake up call and a real challenging transition for me. And again, I'm a grown up, right? Like we think about people going through these things at all phases of life. And like you think that at some point you'll be immune to that type of loss or that type of grief, but that's just not the case.
Yeah. That's kind of like, makes me think of when I get here, everything will be great. You know, when I get to this point in my life, it's going to be this great. So it's obviously not true. And so do you ever look back and just think, wow, like where you started and just the journey of where you are today is like, wow, I can't believe I've moved to Milwaukee to Bristol and to not know what's happening now with College Game Day. Do you ever just like, wow, I can't believe I'm here?
So when I'm reminded to, Jake, by people like you and Wyatt, I do think about that, and it's really incredible. But I call this the plight of the climber. And the plight of the climber is that you're so focused on reaching for that next rung on the ladder and stepping on that next rung of the ladder and continuing to ascend and go up, that you don't spend any time on the current rung celebrating how far you've come. And I'm trying to be better about that, right? Because I know that when I was younger, I wasn't good at it at all. You know, it was like, when am I going to get out of this place? When am I going to get to the next stage? When am I going to get out of this place? When am I going to get to the next stage? And so I have 3 kids. I try to convey to them, like, appreciate the moment you're in. And it really comes in handy now as a parent, because I have a 14-year-old, I have a 5-year-old, and I have a 3-year-old. And there are days when the combination of those 3 is really overwhelming. And I feel like I'm not giving them all that they need or pouring into each of them when they need to be poured into. But I try to take that step back and not fall into the plight of the climber, which is, God, when will these kids be in school? When will this child be in college? Because it's going to go like that. And then I'm going to miss all of these things that are currently happening.
Oh yeah, for sure. So like ESPN, like to Jake and I think like, oh, you're probably working all the time and everything, and your hours are crazy. What are your hours like? Is it pretty crazy? Like you work 12-hour days, or pretty flexible because you have kids?
You know why? It just depends on the season. So during college football season, which starts in earnest the last week of August and runs through the second week of January, we are very busy. We are running around like chickens with our heads cut off, hopping on planes, staying in hotels, doing interviews, going and writing stories and logging stories. It's exhausting. Once college football is over, I have a lot more flexibility with my schedule. I do a radio show in Milwaukee. We're on the ESPN Milwaukee from 7 to 9. So I leave my house around 6 a.m. every morning, knock out a radio show. Then I have a lot of freedom and flexibility the rest of the day. I'll pick up a few projects for ESPN throughout the off season just to continue my storytelling. But for the most part, my ESPN responsibilities are confined to the fall. And we work so much and long hours and long days, like you mentioned, during that stretch, that it sort of balances out having a lot more freedom the rest of the year. And that's not everybody, right? Like, that's just what my schedule is. And a lot of people who exist in the college football space exclusively. But certainly you see people on ESPN who are working year round, and you're probably thinking like, when is the last time they saw their children, or when is the last time they saw their own bed as opposed to a hotel bed? It just depends on what your responsibilities and assignments are.
So what's life like? So you have 14, 5, and 3-year-old, correct? So what's the different, like what's going on with 14 and 3, like what is keeping you busy with them?
Yeah, everything. I mean, you can imagine, right? My 14-year-old's playing sports.
Right.
He's an 8th grader, so in addition to his academics and his sports responsibilities, he's super into girls right now, so that's super fun for a parent to be like navigating that drama. And then the 5-year-old is in her first year of school, so she's in pre-K. And there are a lot of days when she wants to stay home and play with her younger sister. She'll say to me, "Did she play with my toys while I was gone?" I'm like, pretty sure she did. You know, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
pretty sure if they were there, she was playing with them. And then, of course, it's the needs of a 3-year-old, right? And she's pretty articulate, which is helpful once the kids start talking and they can ask for what they want. But she's still a baby, you know, and she still wants to be around mom and
Yeah.
dad. So here's what I will say. I've always been really good at, I would say, vibrating at a high RPM, like frequency. So I'm better when I have a lot of things on my plate. I find that when I don't have things to do, I'm less productive. I don't know where to like focus my energy. And so I'm actually at my best when I go from one responsibility to another, to a next assignment, to this, you know, and it's just how I've always operated, and it works really well for me.
Oh, man. So covering football and having a son, do would you are you okay with your son playing football? Like everyone talk about the head trauma and stuff like that. I mean, what do you think about all that? Like, it's just part of football, or what do you think of the new rules they put in the game?
Such a great question, Wyatt. It is probably the conflict of conscience that a lot of us have when our livelihood and our paychecks are dependent on the sport of football. Like, I recognize that
Yeah.
working for ESPN pays my mortgage, pays my car payment, pays for my kids' school tuition. But I do think that a lot of us in the space recognize that there are, you know, some physical elements and, like you were mentioning, brain trauma associated with the sport. What I try to do is let my son guide us in that. You know, if it seems like he wants to play football, then we will continue to support him in that. We'll make sure he's doing everything necessary to be safe, learn proper technique, have the proper equipment, just not be careless with it. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that it's probably more difficult for parents whose kids have a real future in the sport. I don't know that my son does. We shall see, right? He's in 8th grade. Could be a ton of decisions we have to make down the road. Um, but you're right to ask about what is the reality there. My husband played sports. My husband played football in college. There are conversations that we have about CTE and if he's concerned at all about his mental faculties. I do a show with Mark Chimura. He's a former Green Bay Packers tight end who won a Super Bowl in Green Bay. We joke around about him forgetting things, and it's a good laugh on our show. It's a good, joke on our show. But I think there are days when he is worried about what his future looks like, having played football at a high level for so long. So I don't think there's any part of us that doesn't think about it. It's kind of one of those inconvenient truths. And so you just try to do your best to navigate it and hope that you won't be one of the people affected by it long term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
that's a great answer and response that's coming from a mother, and you just don't, like, you see so much of, like, whatever happened with Tua this year and just all the stuff with the past players in CTE. So, yeah, it's a common
Well,
question
and I
you
did
hear
a
asked, like,
feature,
are you going to let your
Jake,
kid
I
play?
did a feature on Tyler Helinski, who died by
Yeah,
suicide. And his parents, when they did the autopsy, they found CTE on his brain. And so they sit there and wonder how much of his
right.
passing and his challenges and struggles stemmed from traumatic brain injury and CTE. And I guess CTE. And
Right.
then the question was, should they let his younger brother play football? And it's all he loved. It's all he knew. And so they made the decision as a family to let Ryan play football. And now he's a quarterback at Northwestern. So it's just a fascinating and interesting and complicated space to exist in.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
definitely complicated.
All right, let's talk some March Madness. Is Marquette gonna win it all this year, Jen?
I just filled out my bracket this morning. I do have Marquette winning it all. Some of that may be wishful thinking because obviously I'm a huge Marquette fan, having gone there. I was a cheerleader at Marquette. And this past year I did the radio show with Shaka Smart every Thursday night
Oh, nice.
at Dave & Buster's here in the Milwaukee area. And he is
Nice.
such an interesting cat. He's really philosophical. He's really got that team believing and motivated. And I think they could beat anybody. just their style
Yeah.
of basketball and the way
Yeah.
they play with such a intense, focus on the defensive side, defensive end of the floor, and then they can score. My concern is they run into one of these games like they did against UConn earlier this year, not in the Big East tournament, but when they played them in the regular season, where their 3-point shots just weren't falling. And not that they are one
Yeah.
of these teams that is independent, like exclusively reliant on the 3-point ball, but it is a huge part of their game. When I talked to Shaka Smart, he talked about how their preference of shots are inside shots, so inside the paint, then 3-point shots, and then anything else, right? And you're seeing a lot of offenses in basketball that are running that way. But if those 3-point shots aren't falling, can they find the
Right.
offense elsewhere? So, yes, I have them winning on my bracket. I only fill out one bracket. I'm not one of these people who fills out
I like
multiple
it.
brackets and tries to hedge their bets. So I'm riding with Marquette all the way this year. How about you guys?
Nice. I'm the person that fills out like a bunch, but I'm probably going with Duke or
So Marquette will
Alabama.
meet Duke then, and you have Marquette at least meeting Duke. You have
Yeah,
them
the
losing
Elite
to them in
Eight.
the Elite Eight.
Yeah, I have Marquette winning one of my brackets, like one of my
Yeah.
10. So
I mean, you could have like there's probably 10 to 15 teams that say, you tell me they're going to make a run and win. Oh, okay, I believe it. And definitely Marquette is one of them. I picked against. I didn't want to pick Bama, so I just picked UCLA. I don't know. I'd love for Creighton to make a huge run. I'm a huge Creighton.
Creighton
Yeah.
Creighton and Marquette have
Yeah.
gone toe to toe
Yeah.
a number of times this year.
Yep.
The only thing I will say about UCLA, and I love them, by the way, we were out there for game day last year, not this past year, and I got to hang with the basketball team. I think they just had a guy suffer an injury recently,
oh yeah,
and that might be affecting
Yeah,
them
yeah, I just
making
saw
a
that.
deep
Yeah,
run.
yeah.
yeah. He was like was he the leading rebounder or he led him in something? I can't remember.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
but this year's hard because like no team's dominant
Mm-hmm.
really. Everybody's pretty even. But when you were at Marquette, were they pretty good in basketball then?
So when I was at
Or-
Marquette, if you're, again, I have no problem telling you how old I am, but we had Dwayne Wade. So the year
Yes.
after I
Oh,
graduated,
nice.
Dwayne Wade took him to the Final Four with Tom Crean. Travis Diener was another superstar on that team. People know Travis's name because he was also a part of the Golden Eagles TBT team that won the $1 million during the COVID year. So he hit like a
yeah,
last second
nice.
3-point shot for them to win it all. He's local and he owns a gym in our town where he trains, the next generation of basketball stars. So yeah, it was an
Nice.
exciting time
That's
to be at Marquette
awesome.
when I was there.
Yeah.
Oh heck yeah!
Oh,
Just one
sweet.
more thing to wrap it up here. What's your next goal or dream you have for Jen in the future at ESPN or just in your personal life?
I'd love to make a documentary. It's a tricky space because you have to find the right topic and then be able to really like excavate the story. We did a little bit of that this past year with an athlete that died on the soccer field. He ended up having cardiac arrest, and unfortunately, no one brought him a defibrillator, and he ended up dying at soccer practice. And so we did a documentary on that for Outside the Lines. It's a lot of legwork, a lot of digging, a lot of depositions, a lot of interviews, a lot of piecing together a timeline. It's exhaustive work. But there's such a space for that right now, right? Like Netflix is putting documentaries on and Hulu is putting documentaries on and Apple is putting documentaries on, not to mention ESPN Plus that has an incredible one coming out soon about a young lady a track star who, was murdered. So you'll see that one that'll air, within the next few weeks. So that's something I would love to do down the road. But honestly, I've accomplished everything I've ever wanted to. In my sports broadcasting career. So this phase of my life, guys, is really about pouring into my family, raising kind, intelligent, competent, service-minded kids, and just making sure that like that legacy is strong as well. Because I know that people will think of me and they will think about the things I've done from a professional standpoint, but like I'm putting people into the world. And I take that responsibility super seriously. And it's really important that they are good people. So that's where a lot of my focus is, especially in the off season.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's awesome. Dang. I can
thanks
only
for-
imagine what just with a documentary. I don't even. And
Yeah, are you going to make the next story for 30?
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, something like that. Again, you got to find the story,
Yeah.
right? You got to find something that, I mean,
Right,
and look,
right.
I'm in Wisconsin, and there will be no shortage of platforms and people chasing the documentary of the Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers transition and the years he's been under center and how the relationship between him and the front office became fractured when they drafted Jordan Love. And like somebody's going to excavate that story and somebody's going to tell that story. And, you know, like,
Right.
I don't know if I'm cut out for all of that. I've lived through that.
Yeah.
That's been
Yeah.
a little bit daunting at times. But like, you know, there's plenty of great stories out there. So it's finding the story and then
Right.
being able to tell it well in a way that, you know, people want to hear it. You know, you want your
Yeah.
documentary to be one of those that
Right.
goes viral and people are like, did you see that story on Netflix? Did you watch
Yeah.
that? You know, and so that's
Yeah.
that'd be an incredible accomplishment.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, Jen, on Be Unexpected. We really appreciate you coming on. We know you're busy, so
Yeah, we
thanks for
appreciate
spending
it.
the time with us.
Well, you guys are awesome. Wyatt, I will never forget meeting you. I had such a great time with you and your family, and I look forward to the next time that our paths cross. I am headed to Berlin in June for the Special
Ooh,
Olympics World Games. So you guys can catch me hosting
nice.
the opening ceremonies and the closing ceremonies on ABC later this year.
Wow,
Sweet. We'll definitely tune into that. That'd be
that is
fun.
awesome.
Thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
that is really cool. Well, thanks,
Thanks,
See
Jen.
Jen.
ya.